أهلا بك. Thank you all for having me today. I think my presentation is going to build on a lot of what the previous presenters have talked about with a little different dimension.
Can you will share your screen?
Do you see it shared?
Yeah.
Okay,
But
I
you need
just
to
need
make
to
it in a
make
full
it
screen.
full screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't know where to put these. Okay. So the presentation is called 7,000 Years of Living in the Delta, Learning from the Past to Plan the Future. And the reason I did this is that I did some research some years ago on how settlements in the Delta evolved, because I found some historic places that have changed where they are, places that have sunk, places that have, like you see, sand dunes inundate. In this picture, you can see a minaret, barely the top of it, going out of the sand dune, and that's the Mediterranean. This is the village of Kafr Khushway in Kafr Sheikh. And so this led me to be curious, excuse me, how people have managed to populate the Delta for that long, even though it physically changed very dramatically. So we start about 3800 BC. The Delta has been settled more or less about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, once the Nile River stabilized in the form that we know today. And I think it is one of the youngest regions in Egypt. One of the first settlements we know about is Merimdi Bani Salama in Monofea, to the sort of north west of Cairo. And at the time, and up until maybe 100 years ago, when people settled, they settled on a comb or tell, a hill or a turtleback, because as you see from this picture from from the early 20th century, the flooding almost covered most of the arable area, and the villages had to be high up to be prevented, to be safe from flooding. So we move to about 1000 BC, and you see there's many more settlements all across the delta. The delta still hasn't had the shape it has today. The coastline that you see in the dotted line in red here, and it has many branches, much more than the two we have now. And this is the normal formation of any river delta as it meets the sea. They usually have many branches, and you will see how the branches change. And one of the most important changes we know of happened here into the northeast of Avaris, or Pi-Ramses, which is now Tel Daba in Sharqiya. It used to be the northern capital and the capital of Egypt in Ramesset times. And then once the branch, it was on moved, the city died because it depended on the branch for obviously for water and irrigation, but also for trade and transportation. And so what happened later is that the people had to move, and they actually moved a lot of the stone that was there a bit north to what would become Tanis, which is today San al-Hagar. By the turn of the beginning of millennial time, about 25 AD, this is more or less how the delta looked like. It's almost the formation that we know today. The branches are still many. You have a lot of lagoons close to the sea. But something different started happening now, or that history was able to record. Severe Nile floods and the rising seas led to the formation of the Bay of Abu Qir to the east of Alexandria. And when it was formed, the city of Heraklion, or the town of Heraklion at the time, sunk into the sea, as did ancient Alexandria some years later. And here we see a map of the sunken Alexandria in the port. So this is change that is also very disturbing now, knowing that the delta is experiencing sea level rise due to climate change. By the Islamic era, the delta had formed the coastline that we more or less know today. The lagoons are still pretty big and the marsh areas are still pretty big, but you have even more settlements in the delta. But then another environmental change happened, and high floods again sink Canopus, which was near Heraklion, also in the Bay of Abu Qir. And these pictures that we see, this picture is from exploration of Canopus, and here is a map of what the extent, the urban extent looked like, and this is all underwater now. There was also, sorry, I have to go back. There's also other changes that were recorded. If you know Pelusium, Baluza, which is to the east of Port Said, this is before the Suez Canal, so pretty much mainland Egypt and Sinai are connected, but there's actually a fault line running here, and tectonic shifts and earthquake happened that cut off this branch and actually led to Pelusium sinking under sand and other conditions and being cut off from the Nile. And that city died because of this change. And then what started later on is the dam building from the mid 19th century to the mid or 1960, from the Qanatir to the High Dam, led to the biggest control of water flow in the delta and the biggest artificial control on the delta. And here we see the branches now settling on two barely functioning branches. A lot of people of you from Delta will know what happens, especially in the Rashid Rosetta branch in the winter with the Sadda Shetwe, and how the water goes to almost zero level or very low levels. And this has changed the Delta forever, basically. From one side, it has made the delta safe, or the settlement safe from floods. It has added agricultural expansion. The dark green you see is the agricultural expansion up until the 19th century. The light green is all the agricultural expansion that happened later on. You also see the urban agglomerations that we know today, Tanta, Kafr Sheikh, Mansoura, and it actually allowed the expansion of human settlements, because before that the flooding didn't allow them to expand on agricultural land as easily as they do now. So the high dam and all this damming and control of the river had its positive sides, but also had its negative sides. And then going into the future, we have multiple risks. There is the risk of sea level rise that you see here, with the dark water is the 0.5 meter rise that is predicted to flood these parts of the delta. The light blue is a meter rise. Of course, these are not detailed plans. These are all projections of what may happen if business as usual and nothing happens. Another risk that is not talked about, and I think is even more immediate than the sea level rise, is the storms that are now called Medicane. So this is Mediterranean and hurricane together. The word is made up of the two. And you see here, this is the dragon storm, or Asifat al-Tinin, that struck Egypt some months ago, and you see it here in the satellite image. And this brings with it storm surges or little tsunamis compared to the ocean that may affect and have affected places like Alexandria and Rashid. And this brings, this is from Alexandria, I think, in late 2019. So all these challenges affecting, oh, I'm sorry. Is something that has to be taken into consideration. So going to these images, I think Dr. Khoury also showed something like this, is the expansion actually of the delta that is happening. And with these changes, we have to think of where will people go. So the two main pushes that we see for migration One is, of course, the sea level rise and the climate change, but also food sovereignty. If we are to try and preserve as much as we can of the agricultural land, population migration has to happen outside of the delta. Either the expansion of the population, so the added population, not the existing population, but then also in the northern parts, the existing population also has to move. And in the images that we see, which are mostly from 1984 to 2015, we see very big expansions to the southeast of the delta and the southwest of the delta that happened mostly in urban projects like the new cities, but actually more in the rural projects of land reclamation. And this one shows that a very sort of quick calculation of about 2.3 million faddans were added in 30 years to the east and to the west. And these aren't necessarily all utilized, but this is where we see human activity expand. So this is an average of about 76,000 faddans a year, which is not insignificant. But then when we look at the population densities and how much of people live in these expansions, we see it is very, very low. This is the Shiecha composition of population densities based on the 2006 census. And we see how the population density is still very much in the heart of the delta. But to the north, which is actually very good, that there isn't a lot of density, except in certain urban agglomerations like Dumyat and Borg Borulus, and here in Alexandria, most of the density is concentrated here, but then very little density and very little population has moved to these expansions. Moving on to 2017, which is the latest data we have, we actually see more density happening on the Dumyat branch, even less than what's happening in the Rashid. But then here, the Alexandria metropolis is growing with Damanhur. But then again, to the southwest and southeast, very little population movement. This brings me to talk about density also in different ways, and this is important for us to know, is that usually when density is presented, like the graphs that I showed you before, they talk about gross density. So, but that was the thing with the sheikhs, is that it shows density to be more realistic. If we do it on the governorate level, especially gross density, it is very misleading. So a governorate like Minya, which has a very big desert hinterland and only this part of it is inhabited, would show a very low density of 150 persons per square kilometer, compared to Gharbeya, which has no desert hinterland. It shows about 2,500 persons per square kilometer. When we move to the inhabited area, so this is both urban and rural land that are inhabited, Minya shoots up to about 2,400. So it almost has the same inhabited density as Gharbeya does, even though it has all this urban or potential area to expand. And Gharbeya is still the same. South Sinai, of course, is one of the least dense. So you're talking about 5 people in gross density, and then even the inhabited is about 600. When you go to the built-up density, Minya and Gharbeya still also have very similar densities, about 18,000 people per square kilometers. This is relatively high density considering that this is an average density for built-up area. And while it is very understandable that Gharbeya has this kind of density, it is not at all understandable. It's actually a complete mystery that Minya would have a similar density. And it goes to show that there is something happening in the planning and in the expansion of urban settlements that must be addressed. So here on the governorate level overall on Egypt, we see the gross density map again, and the delta, of course, is the highest density in terms of gross density. You see most of them here, and if you add Al-Ubayya to it, which I had put in with the Greater Cairo, Al-Ubayya actually has the highest gross density in all of Egypt. But then when you go to the built-up density, you see the delta going lower, and actually Kafr al-Sheikh, Monofea, Beheira are all relatively low density. Only Shar'iyya has the highest density in terms of built-up area, even though Shar'iyya has a desert, a very large desert hinterland. So here we can also do like a little case study of this kind of urban expansion and density. This part is of the new Sadat city, the new Sadat city, which was inaugurated in the late 1970s. About 120,000 faddans were earmarked or designated for the city. It's almost a square that you see here. But actually what happened is that over 40 years, only this urban expansion happened. So it is a fraction of the area that was earmarked. At the other hand, all this area you see more to the left of the picture is the new desert land reclamation schemes of Kharigin. And here you see 3 villages. I think there's even one more here. But what for me is interesting is that both of them are very low density. And if you compare both the rural new expansion and the urban new expansion, it is very crazy that they have the same density. Another thing that happened is that after 2011, people started encroaching on the land of Sadat that didn't happen before, but by cultivation. And they cultivated about 34,000 faddans. It's huge. But then what happened was is that these were termed as transgressions by the state, who wanted to still use Sadat for urban expansion because of the money that can be generated from selling the land as urban and not as for cultivation. So almost most of these 34,000 faddans were actually demolished by the government. But till now, and I think for a very long time in the future, this part will not be developed, and even if it's developed, will not be occupied. So here we see one of the main problems of urban planning in Egypt is these mega projects. Excuse me. So on one side, you have the mega projects that are based on mostly rural expansion. At the bottom here of the graph in the dark, you see the percentage of Egypt that is utilized. And this is what is always said, is that we're only living on 3%, 5%, 7%, depending on the time and on the calculation. And we need to expand this. So one of the earliest projects that we see is the Tahrir province, Mudiriyat Tahrir, in the 1950s. And other expansion projects at the time wanted to raise to almost double the inhabited landmass of Egypt from 3% at the time to about 7%. Didn't happen. The new map policy in the late 1970s from the Sadat era wanted to go up to 35%. Of course, this didn't happen. And this was supposed to happen by the year 2000. By the year 2000, we are barely more than 5%. And then the other plan from 97 to 2017, Khat Tanmiyah, wanted to increase to 25%. Today we have the Egypt 2030 wants to go up to about 10 or 11%. Egypt 2052 wants to go up to 14% by 2052. But if we go by what happened before, this is more or less the rate of the expansion that happens. If we move on to look at the new cities, the targets have always, of the population that would live in these new cities, have always far outstripped what in reality happens. So this graph shows from the beginning of the New City Program in 1976 to the 2016 census. One of the targets was actually by 2016, there would be 8 million people living there. But the census shows us that about 1.3 million people are living in new cities. So far, far less than the targets show. One of the reasons behind these failures of the targets and this movement is the centralization of planning that Meher had also talked about before me. And here, this is a study that I did in 2013 called Social Justice in the Built Environment. And in one of them, I looked at how the government agencies are stacked up and how the planning process works. So the problem with the central government is that there are many agencies happening and coordinating at the central level, but actually at the local level, there is very, very little control or even participation, whether of officials or of citizens, that happen in these plans. Another problem happens when they reach the regional level, which exists only in theoretical terms. And some of the some of the government departments have regional departments, such as the GOPP, هيئة تخطيط عمراني, and the Ministry of Planning's هيئة التخطيط الإقليمي, the regional planning agency. But at the end of the day, these do not work because there is no administration for these regions. And then when it comes to these expansion plans, they happen outside of this almost entire planning system because they go in parallel. So you have the جهاز الوطني لتخطيط استخدامات أراضي الدولة, that is associated with the cabinet, that oversees the allocation of land to these central agencies, or its agencies attributed to central government. So, for example, the new Urban Communities Authority, which is affiliated to the Ministry of Housing, gets the land from the NCPSLU, and then it operates the land on its own, completely independent from the local government it exists in. So, for example, Sadat City is run by NUCA and the Ministry of Housing, and not run by the governor of Munofea, and so on. And also the Qura al-Kharijin would be run by an agency that is affiliated with the Ministry of Agriculture, and again, not by the governorate. And this creates this kind of dichotomy of planning that does not integrate any of what is happening. Another problem with the planning regions is that what you see here on the right is the planning regions as defined by the GOPP. When you look at the Delta region is actually only the heart of the Delta, but it does not include either the east side, which is mostly Sharqiya and Port Said, which are the Suez Canal region, nor the western side, which is the Alexandria region, which is mostly Bahira and this other valuable desert hinterland. Actually, the only desert that the Delta region has is the Sadat city region or area around it. So this is very limiting to how you can plan expansion, plan for disaster. I mean, looking at the risks that the Delta is facing, whether sea level rise, storm surges, or food sovereignty, these all have to be, in order to be taken into consideration, we need to completely redraw how planning happens or operates, especially in this particular region, which probably has more than half of Egypt's population. So first thing to be done is that the regions have to be redrawn. And again, regions usually, if they're not purely administrative, then they can change by the programs. So you can have economic regions that are different than urban planning regions, that are different than environmental regions. Each one of them would operate independently, but within an integrated planning system. The other thing, of course, is to decentralize the administration to both regional and local levels. So here is one of the recommendations that was in social justice in the built environment, is to actually maybe keep the central structure, but then the central structure has to operate directly integrated with a planning مديرية or unit or agency within the governorate. And this is just the graph here is for the governorate level, but then this can also be duplicated for the regional level. And when you bring in local councils and even regional councils that are elected, then you ensure the citizen participation, and you ensure that planning whether for the maintenance of the existing built environment or the, I'm sorry, I don't know why this keeps happening, um, or the kind of development of the existing built environment, plus the development of expansions would happen in a more integrated manner. The third thing, of course, is to move, and this would actually help the move from mega projects to more regional and local projects that would have easier targets, more transparent funding systems, more realistic or feasible funding for them to be implemented, but also more importantly, easier to monitor and to change with time, something that we really need, especially if we're looking at the North Delta. And the fourth and last thing is to actually rethink density and try and understand it in different ways. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Yahya, for sharing your experience and research findings along the previous years. Sorry, I didn't have the chance to introduce you well because I had the connection problem, but yes, still I would prefer to do it even after you have presented already. So Yahya is a housing and urban policy researcher who specializes in legislative analysis, data visualization, and historical mapping. He's research coordinator for Tooba, a research studio he co-founded in 2014 that focuses on spatial justice and fair housing. He also edits the Built Environment Observatory, and he is the author of Egypt's Housing Crisis, The Shaping of Urban Space, published by the AUC Press this year, correct? Mm-hmm. 20. So yeah, this is one of the most updated kind of research and intellectual contribution to the discourse of housing and urbanism in Egypt. I haven't yet read it, but it's on my plan to read. So yeah, so if you have questions, quick comments. Along the last years. Okay, so this is a comment from the Busi, staff from University. Many thanks for not only for your presentation, but also for your efforts and publications along the last years. Well, okay, till we get any questions, I can highlight a couple of remarks based on like...
Hannah Hassan raised her hand.
Sorry?
Hannah,
okay, please.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for the amazing presentation. It was very informative. I want to ask a question. As we saw in the maps before, there's a severe expansion around the Delta area, but with no whatsoever usage. Is it an awareness issue, or is there other reasons keeping people from settling down there? Maybe an infrastructure issue, just like the Ibn Baitak project, where there is still issues with the government for not providing the necessary infrastructure? Or is it maybe just people not wanting to commute to work every day for 2 or 3 hours? Thank you.
I think people, if you look at a lot of the work on transportation, you'll find that a lot of people actually commute 4 hours every day, whether to go from the Delta to Alexandria or the Delta to Cairo or even the 10th of Ramadan. So there is a lot of commuting that is already happening for work and for economic reasons. But looking especially at the desert land reclamation and the new cities, you have a problem of planning and accessibility. So at the Delta projects, there is a complete breakdown. Like, you see all this land that is given to land reclamation and only villages are offered, but there is no planning for the normal hierarchy of human settlements that moves from village to town to city, and then with it the associated services. So, for example, there is a lot of the desert land reclamation. They don't come automatically or directly with schools or with hospitals. So for families to move there, it is very hard. So what happens is mostly the men move there, and then the families only visit them in the festivals or Naid and so on, or the men actually leave it and go to the original villages in the holidays. So again, this is a problem of integration. The Ministry of Agriculture does not build hospitals and does not build schools. And like we saw from Maher's presentation, most of these ministries don't have the resources to expand, even if you divide a certain area into 3 districts instead of 1. So again, this is the lack of integrated planning. So planning is very physical. You plan and even then it doesn't work very well. So for example, Nuka would plan the new city, but would very rarely talk to other agencies and other ministries about what it needs for them to be able to move there and put services there. So this is a very big problem when it comes to these places. The other problem that happens in the urban communities and new urban communities is that they are inaccessible by price. So a lot of them are too expensive for people to move there. Again, work opportunities are not there, or they mismatch the real estate that is there. So, for example, Sadet and 10th of Ramadan have very big industrial zones, but the workers there cannot afford to buy apartments there to live there. Also, another thing would be the precarity of jobs. So you don't have job security in a lot of the industrial areas. You don't have proper contracts, you don't have long-term contracts. So it is a very big investment to socially move to these places when you do not have the security to know that you will have a job for enough time to undertake this investment.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Yahya. Mahmoud Bak, you have a question? From Mansoura University?
He wrote it in the chat.
Yeah, but I want him to say it.
I can say, so thank you, Dr. Yahya. So in your opinion, how can we change the current situation of the centralization, or is the government policy and we have nothing to do at the moment?
Well, we have a lot to do, but then what we do is 2 things. First, we need to try and change the policy as much as we can. So, and find ways to do that, whether mostly now by trying to convince decision makers that the main policy has to change. The other thing is that most of you, or a lot of you, are going to be decision makers in some time, or work in decision making. I mean, anyone that works in planning has the government as a client or will work for the government. So this is another change that has to come with time, is that to change the mindset, the new generation, you have to go in with this mindset and try and change by work. Another thing is to look at planning that is not perfect. And this is something that Dr. Al-Khouli has also talked about, is that the difference between planning as something being sort of very utopian and very smooth and happening, or this kind of muddling through, is that planning happens in imperfect situations, and that we always need to be much more flexible than we are either taught or that planning makes us think.
Okay, thanks, Yahya, for this kind of even discussion. I mean, the day is long, and we learned a lot from several contributions from valuable, respectful speakers, and actually, I think many of the recommendations are being repeated. So. Yeah, when you mentioned, for example, the redrawing the regions, it was mentioned by Dr. Faisal with Dr. Al-Khouri. I mean, it's very obvious, and of course we can also understand, maybe we try to understand why this is not being activated. And yeah, decentralization changing policies. I think maybe policy, let's say, papers could be a good way of communication between the researchers or academics and let's say executives, city executives, or maybe politicians. Somehow of communication channels should be opened, and sometimes I think giving the recipe and convincing them that this might also lead to maybe even better future, then I think this can change reality. Because one of the questions was about, can we do something? So I think it is still possible if we just tell them, well, according to this and this study, if we do it that way, we will also be reaching some good qualities of cities, and we are not losing the advantage of what we have now. So the fearness of change, I think this is one of the dominating mindsets of the let's say policy makers or